Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. It's the 1st of August, and we come to air today on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube with remarkable news. Having spent the better part of this week covering the bitter edges of this presidential campaign, we can tell you today that Evan Gershkovich is free. So are many others as part of the biggest prisoner swap with Russia since the Cold War. We're going to be hearing from President Biden in just a couple of moments. The state dining room is set, and the commander-in-chief will be announcing something remarkable here that has come together over the balance of weeks as Russia has freed Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, as well as jailed Kremlin critics in the largest prisoner exchange with the West in decades. We have a statement from Jake Sullivan, of course, National Security Advisor at the White House. Not since the Cold War, he says, has there been a similar number of individuals exchanged in this way, and there has never, so far as we know, been an exchange involving so many countries. Indeed, this took place. The swap on the tarmac in Ankara, Turkey, included 24 people. 24 people. 16 going to the West, 8 being returned to Russia. Among them, as I mentioned, Evan Gershkovich, but also Paul Whelan. Gershkovich was arrested in March of last year on a reporting assignment in Russia. Paul Whelan, of course, was jailed in 2018. Later convicted on spying charges that he denies. I have another name for you that you will know if you watch this program or listen to Balance of Power. Alsu Komarsheva, the journalist with dual Russian and U.S. citizenship who was convicted just last month under the Kremlin's wartime censorship laws, is going to be reunited with her family if she has not been already. We brought you a conversation with her husband Pavel and her daughter Bibi on this program. They will be back together. So as we wait to hear from Joe Biden, we want to get a behind-the-scenes view on what just transpired and is still happening now with Bruen, the president of the Global Situation Room, a former diplomat who brings his national security expertise to us here on Balance of Power. Brett, when you consider the scale and the number of countries involved here, this is something that must have been in the works for some time. How do you see it?
Well, it's three-dimensional diplomacy, the most complex kind of diplomacy, because obviously you're working not only on a bilateral level, trying to figure out what Moscow is willing to give and what they want in exchange, but then you've got to work these other countries as well. And they have, shockingly, their own interests, their own concerns. And so it isn't an easy effort. And, you know, hats go off to Biden's team for being able to pull this off. That being said, Joe, and I know you and I have talked about it before, I do have concerns that these kinds of exchanges also incentivize Putin and other autocratic rulers to take Americans captive and to hold them for these kinds of concessions.
That is something that I suspect Joe Biden will want to speak to, Brett, a very real concern, as are the concerns about some of the people that are going back to Russia here, including Vadim Krasikov, who was serving a life sentence in Germany for the killing in 2019 of a Chechen separatist in a Berlin park where he was shot dead. At what cost are the Americans coming home?
Well, and I think that is precisely the point, Joe, because Putin is going to be able to use this to great propaganda effect. He's going to be able to tell those who are fighting on the front lines in Ukraine, as well as others in the Russian military intelligence services, that we will, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, be able to bring you home. And that will embolden Russian security forces to do even more. And I don't have to tell you, there are bold acts, whether it's in Germany or in the United Kingdom or in other parts of the world. Africa, as one recent example we've seen with the Wagner Group, have had a very destabilizing, a very dangerous effect on countries. And I think it's important when we take these acts, and let me be clear, we should do everything in our power to bring Americans who are unjustly detained overseas home. It's something that I did when I was a diplomat serving overseas. But I do feel that this ought to be a moment where we reflect and we reset, because Putin is not done. And other autocratic leaders are watching and saying, I can get the U.S.'s attention. I can get concessions from the U.S. if I take another American journalist captive.
Now that this group is coming home, Gershkovich, Whelan, Kurmasheva, officials are talking about this as one of the few remaining areas of diplomatic cooperation between the United States and Russia. Do we need to raise the bar?
Well, look, it is a bright spot in what otherwise is a pretty bleak time for U.S.-Russian relations. And I think it's encouraging in the sense that we can still have these difficult dialogues and ultimately get to some common ground. That being said, I think Putin, again, can leverage it and point to this deal and say, the West, the U.S. is willing to negotiate in Ukraine. Just keep fighting, just keep pushing, and we will get a deal, because ultimately they will bend, they will bow to the public pressure on these issues. And I think it's also important, and Joe, if I go back to Brittany Griner, the WNBA star, there was an unprecedented level of engagement from the president, the secretary of state, the national security advisor that we had never seen in U.S. Hostage negotiations. And what concerned me about it was that if Putin believes, if some of these other autocratic leaders believe they can get the president's attention by taking someone who has a high public profile hostage, then we're going to see more of that. And so while it's wonderful that Brittany Griner is playing alongside American teammates now at the Paris Olympics, I do worry for other U.S. sports figures. I do worry for other American journalists. And I think the caution everyone should take from this is to take much more caution when you're traveling to some of these countries.
A great conversation with a lot to think about today from Brett Bruen. Brett, thank you for being with us from the Global Situation Room here in the nation's capital. Former diplomat with us live on Balance of Power as we stand by to hear from Joe Biden. We will when he speaks. The state dining room will be the venue, and we'll see who joins the president. The optics here will be important today as we balance a couple of different stories here, including what's happening in Israel, bracing for revenge here, bracing for a retaliatory strike or event of some sort from Iran, following what we described to you yesterday, the twin killings, obviously the operative from Hezbollah who was behind the strike in the Golan Heights, and then yesterday the political leader of Hamas in Tehran. Pretty remarkable and bold move that has a lot of folks wondering exactly what is going to come next. The IDF is bracing and preparing for a couple of different scenarios here, and we wanted to talk about them with Michael Knights. A very delicate moment here in geopolitics. Jill and Jay Bernstein Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Michael, it's great to have you back. I wonder what your expectations are in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Thanks for having me. I think the expectation is that as soon as the funeral of the senior Hamas figure is completed on Friday, from that point onwards, Israel is bracing for an attack from as early as Saturday morning, and an attack that may come not just from Iran, but also from Lebanese Hezbollah, from the Iraqi and Syrian militias tied to Iran, and from the Houthis in Yemen as well. So it could be a rerun of April's Iran-Israel exchange of fire, but with a larger number of actors.
Well, this is obviously, as I mentioned, a delicate moment that could take on a couple of different forms here. And there have been questions about whether we'd see a repeat of what we saw in April. Clearly, none of the parties here from what we've heard, at least, and maybe you can disagree with some of the smart analysis that we've heard on this program, that none of the parties involved want to see an escalation into a regional conflict. Will that keep the tit for tat under control after whatever's about to happen?
Everybody agrees that actors would prefer not to see their home nations seriously destroyed, whether it's Lebanese Hezbollah, the Iranians, or the Israelis. And yet, the players, including Netanyahu most recently, take choices that do risk a broader war. And what Netanyahu, ultimately decided to authorize in the last sort of 36 hours were, two of the highest profile strikes Israel has ever done, extraordinarily successful. But if you're on the edge of potentially closing a major hostage rescue deal, which has been strongly encouraged by the Americans and brokered by the Qataris and the Egyptians, it's an odd thing to do, to kill the Hamas leader, who, for all of his faults, was probably the one pushing for that hostage exchange deal the strongest. So it shows you that people are willing to risk going to higher levels of escalation, and the Israelis in particular feel like they have what you would call escalation dominance. In other words, they can kill Hezbollah commanders and Hamas commanders, and they're still going to ultimately get their way in the end, whether that's Hezbollah withdrawal from the border or a hostage deal in which Hamas surrenders remaining Israeli and Western hostages.
We're spending some time with Michael Knights as we wait to hear from Joe Biden, and we do have word on a 2-minute warning from the White House. President Biden will be speaking to the prisoner swap from the White House in just 2 minutes from now. Michael, is this once again a move to escalate in an effort to de-escalate like we saw a few months ago?
Yes, it is. And just to, when you're talking about the prisoner swap, you're probably talking about the Russian-US one, right? Not the Israel-Palestine one that we were just discussing.
Yes, but getting back to the matter of, yes, but I'm asking you about Israel and Iran and the setup here optically in an effort to escalate to de-escalate.
Got it. Just clarifying for the listener. So, at the moment, we're now going to move back into de-escalation mode, but Iran probably, in a sense, will be allowed to do one strike out at Israel because of the Israelis will probably say that's fair game, and the Americans too. If that strike is too heavy, though, then a new sequence begins again. The Israelis will hit back, will work out how hard they hit back, and then the Iranians will hit back. So everybody, we can either get this one and done now, where the Iranians hit back and it's not too bad, and everybody says, okay, fair's fair, or somebody hits too hard or is accidentally too successful in striking Israel, and we go into a subsequent round of tit for tat.
Michael, it's great to have you back, and we appreciate the time to have you on Bloomberg, as always. Michael Knights at the Washington Institute, with our eyes on the situation in Israel and Iran, and of course in Gaza, with so many things to unfold still.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Now confirmed by the President of the United States. If you were with us a short time ago, we had live remarks from Joe Biden at the White House confirming the release of Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, Alsu Kramasheva, and Vladimir Kara-Murza as part of the biggest prisoner swap with Russia since the Cold War, involving 24 people and about a half dozen countries. The president acknowledging our allies and thanking them in Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, saying in the United States, we stand for freedom and liberty, for justice, not only for our own people, but for others as well. We assembled our panel today, having thought we'd be talking about, as I said earlier, the bitter edges of the presidential campaign, and we will get there as they carve out 2 hours for us each day to talk politics. But right now, this moment, with Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeanne, of course, political science professor at Iona and Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Great to see you both. Jeanne, this is a big moment for Joe Biden. Would it have happened if he had not dropped out of the race?
I don't think we know, but we're still learning when this came about, which seems to be several months ago. But can I just say, what a moment for these families that were standing there. The little 12-year-old girl turns 13 tomorrow. Yeah. Crying after the president sings happy birthday to her. The Whelans talking about the fact the many years that they have suffered through this. I mean, what a moment for all of these families and, of course, the prisoners who are coming home. In terms of Joe Biden, we are starting to learn that this has been in the works for a long time. I suspect it would have still happened regardless of whether he dropped out or not. And in fact, we heard, and I think this has to be verified, but the very day he withdrew from the race, he was on the phone talking to allies around the world to make sure that his withdrawal and changes going on domestically here and elsewhere didn't impact this deal, which was coming together. They were worried it might fall apart. So I suspect it would have come through either way. But what a moment for Joe Biden, but more importantly for these families.
Well, absolutely. And you're right, Jeanne, to see Al-Su's husband, Pavel, and their daughters, Bibi and Miriam. We introduced our listeners and viewers, as you well know, to Pavel and Bibi here in our studios a couple of weeks ago. It was pretty hard to keep it together watching all of that, Rick. A very poignant moment today for the administration, but also for the country, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is the kind of thing we want governments to work together on. Obviously, it was a massive effort by the White House and other countries to formulate a strategy to be able to make this exchange. Lots of people involved. I'd like to have a shout out to Vladimir Kara-Murza's family. He was very close to John McCain and has participated in very many McCain Institute programs over the years. In fact, was with us in Sedona, Arizona, just prior to returning to Russia to continue his work when he was arrested. So our prayers are answered. He's coming home, and I know he'll be welcome by his family and many of us who think the work he has done has been very important.
Of course, the campaign is injected into this before Joe Biden even leaves the room. Reporters are asking questions, Jeanne, and the last one, it's always the last question, isn't it? He decided to hang around and answer the last question. It was about Trump, who says he could have done this in a day. The president went back to the microphone. It's like, man, the communications staff is having some tough memories here. What's he going to say? And it was a simple answer. Why didn't he do it when he was in office? How did that play politically?
I think that is the response. We're already hearing from J.D. Vance that the reason this may have happened is because Russia feared Donald Trump coming into office. And of course, he's so much stronger than the Democrats would be. And of course, we know what Donald Trump will say. At least we can guess. He's going to say, as he said, he could get this done in a day. Joe Biden gave away the farm. This makes the world more dangerous. Putin would have listened to me. We know what he'll say. But Joe Biden's response was simple and accurate. You were in office from 2017 to 2020. Whalen, at least, was taken in 2018 or imprisoned in 2018. You had 2 years to do this and you didn't get it done. And, one thing to remember about all of this, it doesn't happen at this scope with 7+ countries involved without really strong allies. And that is an argument I hope Democrats make on this. Donald Trump could not have made this agreement because it involved, for instance, the German chancellor, with whom he doesn't have a strong relationship at this point. So how was he going to get this done? Joe Biden did it because of his strong relationships with allies. So it is a difference as we talk about, removing ourselves potentially from NATO or making them pay for what's happening in Ukraine. All of these things we hear J.D. Vance and Donald Trump saying that, we need to turn inward. When you turn inward, there's a cost, and that cost is things like this. We need allies to secure releases like this, and Joe Biden showed how that's done.
Well, what's your take on that, Rick? Because Joe Biden did go out of his way to talk about the power of alliances. He said, anyone who questioned if allies matter, they do. They matter. And he named Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, went out of his way again after to thank the chancellor. All of that, I guess, making the point that Jeanne was trying to there. Is that the takeaway today?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it. It wasn't the U.S. acts alone in a vacuum. In fact, maybe one of the most important aspects of our soft power around the world is our convening capability. There are very few countries who can assemble like that group that in many cases have a lot of existing animosity toward one another and pull them together in an exercise like this. And so our goodwill around the world is a commodity that it goes under noticed. And frankly, it's what protects us, because the best deterrent we have from countries like North Korea, China, Russia, being even more aggressive than they are, is our friends and allies around the world who are willing to help us secure peace. So absolutely is part of the message. And I think that it's something that we don't probably talk about enough, in the United States. And let me just say, too, in 2017, Vladimir Kara-Murza was poisoned by Vladimir Putin. And Donald Trump did nothing in retribution to Vladimir Putin for that act. So regardless of what he says today about how tough he could be on Vladimir Putin, he let him get away with these kinds of acts of aggression, attack, in some cases murder, without much pushback at all.
A little reality check from Rick and Jeanne here. Jeanne, I'll bring our listeners and viewers in on a little behind the scenes. We were supposed to be talking about Donald Trump right now at the NABJ, and we're going to have time to get to that, because that too was a remarkable moment on the campaign trail yesterday. But isn't it amazing that, again, in this 12-minute long news cycle that we're in, our attention is moved by a major development, and in this case, something that transcends, I think, in importance to a lot of the bickering that we see and hear on the campaign trail. And I don't mean that in any specific reference to some of the things that have been said. But isn't it incredible how our attention comes away once again from Donald Trump and moves back to what's happening in the real world? And in this case, you tell me, a benefit to the Democrats?
I think a benefit to Joe Biden's legacy. I think, obviously, most importantly, a benefit to these families, to the American public. But I also think there are real serious policy considerations for the United States government here, Republican, Democrats, all of us alike, which is there has been a rise in state hostage taking, state imprisonments. We've seen that in Israel. I mean, not Israel. We've seen that in Russia, rather. We've seen it in Iran. We've seen it around the world. Those numbers are rising. We obviously still have prisoners captured by Hamas, who are still there since October 7th with very little understanding of their health, their well-being, their status. So I do think the U.S. government has to have a serious policy consideration here. How do you move forward and ensure deals like this don't come at the, endangering all of us by making us all more vulnerable as we go around the world, number one. And number two, how do you create a cost for these states who are taking innocent Americans around the world and holding them prisoner in exchange for something like this? Yeah. That's a serious consideration for all of us, regardless of party.
Rick, does this help Democrats in their association with success in foreign policy broadly, or is this a Joe Biden story?
I think the rising tide carries all the boats. I think that this shows competency, which has been a foreign policy, national security issue within the Biden administration. Obviously, it's been an issue around other things like the economy. If the economy improves, the ticket improves, right? If the view on national security improves, it helps the ticket. I think that it is the kind of thing that for sure will help emblazon Joe Biden's legacy. But I do think there is a competency check today that will enhance Vice President Harris's campaign prospects.
We learned, and I'm not sure we've had a chance to talk about it yet, that Joe Biden is going to headline the first night at the Democratic National Convention. We've had a couple of conversations about what are they going to do with the president at Kamala Harris's convention now. What night do they have him introduce her? I think some have suggested they try to keep him as far away from her as possible, and we now know it's a primetime slot on night one, when we can probably all agree that the fewest number of people are watching. But this is the kind of tape we're going to see, right, Jeanne?
Yeah, I think so. We're going to see the greatest hits of Joe Biden. It's going to be exciting because I get to be there with you and Rick and Kailey and everybody else. So I am looking forward to it. Maybe the president sits down with you and Kailey and has a long chat about his legacy.
The questions we would ask. Rick, would you have put Joe Biden on Monday night at your convention? Is that good placement?
You know, it's a unique situation because not only is he the sitting president and he's unpopular, so that creates, different conflicts. But he actually, up until 10 days ago, was the candidate who was nominated by, the delegate, who were going to be nominated by the delegates at this convention. So I think you have to give the guy a break and give him a slot and let him knock himself out. He's got a story to tell about his administration, and for the Monday night of a convention, I think it's almost mandatory. But they run the risk of putting an intensely unpopular elected official in front of the American public, extolling their virtues.
Of course, Rick Davis had to deal with I don't know if it's a similar situation, but a whole different president at his convention. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our signature panel, with us back in hour 2. We're going to explore this breaking story about the prisoner swap a lot more. Kailey will join us, and we'll talk again about the latest on the campaign trail. Donald Trump doubling down on the attacks, in some cases, racial attacks against Kamala Harris. We'll have more of it ahead, only on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Nearly 24 hours ago, we were all captivated watching the screen as Donald Trump took part in a mediated conversation at the National Association of Black Journalists Conference in Chicago and made a few remarks that stood out. But of course, let's remind you of the big one.
I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much. And she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
That was yesterday, and we had a conversation a short time later with the congressman from Missouri, Emanuel Cleaver, a Democrat, of course, who was once chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. His reaction.
We are in a really awful situation. I mean, what the president said, and I don't think he gets it, and I hope somebody close to him will explain it. It was offensive, it was racially raunchy, and it was not becoming of a head of state.
Move forward a couple of hours, and Donald Trump doubles down on Truth Social. Quote, "Crazy Kamala is saying she's Indian, not black. This is a big deal. Stone cold phony," unquote. J.D. Vance, his running mate, on the stump last night, referring to Kamala Harris as a phony, having a chameleon-like nature. And so there are many questions about where this rhetoric is going and exactly how Kamala Harris should respond to it, what it means about the political discourse in this country. And we're joined right now by a Democratic member of Congress from the important swing state of Wisconsin. Gwen Moore is with us from Wisconsin's 4th District. And Congresswoman, I want to welcome you back to Bloomberg TV and radio. What do you make of this conversation in 2024?
Well, thanks for having me. I think, to be fair to Donald Trump, with the black journalists, it was a hard crowd. And to be fair to the journalists, they had a very hard respondent. I think Donald Trump, we have to give him credit for really hitting all of his messaging points to keep people in fear of losing their jobs because of, the immigrants are overrunning the border and taking black jobs, and that they are overrunning the borders, that they're criminals and rapists, that they're killing people. A real exaggeration. And I wish this fact check in real time had been the journalists interrupting him because people believe that. And I think fear and xenophobia and a fear of white people being overrun by others. He was able to stay on message despite the very tough crowd that he was talking with, and of course the Black journalists themselves were scratching their heads, wondering why they had even invited him. So,
Yeah, well,
I
certainly.
don't think it changed anybody's minds either way.
Well, certainly, Congresswoman, we saw things get combative a few times, specifically with Rachel Scott of ABC, who did try to fact check the former president at multiple times throughout the conversation. And it actually did seem that what set the whole thing off was her introductory question, in which she repeated a number of statements around Black individuals, Black journalists that Donald Trump had made, and asked him essentially why someone considering, a Black voter considering whether or not to cast that vote for him in November should make of that kind of rhetoric. What would you tell a Black voter considering whether or not to vote for Donald Trump or instead to choose Kamala Harris?
Well, what the Black journalists were trying to demonstrate, just listen to what he says. It has me scratching my heads as to why any Black person would vote for him, except for those people who are exceptionally wealthy, or except for those rappers and so on who expect to be pardoned. But it's a curiosity. It's a curiosity why he even accepted the invitation to come. You have to give him credit for showing up for that very tough crowd. But again, I don't think anybody's minds were changed, and I think Black voters who saw it probably that increased their resolve to vote for Kamala Harris.
I'm struck by your approach here, Congresswoman. I'm trying to follow what you're saying as closely as I can. I don't know if this is a little bit of reverse psychology, but are you giving Donald Trump credit for having continuity in being racist?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that he sounded like a true believer that Mexicans and other people, criminals, were overrunning the border and taking Black jobs. I doubt that they were taking any of the Black journalists' jobs that were sitting in that room. But he did have a huge platform for scaring other Black people who may be marginalized and inappropriately blame people who crossed the border. I mean, he had message discipline. He never got off of his big hits. He even when he said that Kamala, he didn't realize she was Black until recently. She was pretending to not be Black. Even then, he was sort of appealing to some segment of the Black community who may not feel like she's Black enough, even though she went to Howard University, had a Black father. She joined the first Black sorority installed in the United States. People, some Black people who might have some very nationalistic views about what a Black person ought to look like and be like and sound like. So he stuck with the grievance message. He stuck with the others message. He stuck with the victimhood message. And that, unfortunately, has appeal to some people. I do think he was talking to his supporters. His supporters might have been gleeful about him pushing back against these Black women and talking over them. Yeah. And I'm sure that they were very pleased with his performance.
Okay, so that's Donald Trump's message, Congresswoman. I also would like to ask you about the message the vice president could be bringing next week when she's planning to visit your home state of Wisconsin alongside her vice presidential pick, whomever that may be. What message wins Wisconsin for her? And is there a vice presidential pick that you think would be most likely to aid her in that effort in Wisconsin?
I think Wisconsin is very willing and able statewide to elect a Democrat to the presidency. I think that we have had enough of Donald Trump, and even the Republicans, and we have seen the performance in so-called Republican areas improve for Democrats statewide. So I do think that Kamala, with whomever she picks, is going to be welcomed in Wisconsin. You know, there's a lot of talk back and forth about who she ought to pick. I hope she picks someone with whom she has a good rapport, someone that she trusts, somebody that shares her vision. And I think there are a lot of great candidates of whom we've heard discussed over the networks in the past few days. I think any one of them would be very welcomed in Wisconsin.
All right. Well, we should find out within the next few days. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We always appreciate your time. That is Congresswoman Gwen Moore of Wisconsin. Thank you. And let's turn back now in our final moments with our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are still with us. So, Jeanne, I would love to just get your reaction to what we just heard from Congresswoman Moore. This idea that Donald Trump may have been racist yesterday, but at least he was consistent and disciplined about that message. What do you think?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that. I think, my impression, and I would assume the representative might agree with this, is it was the old Donald Trump we've all gotten used to. There was nothing new there. He's struggling in the polls. He's struggling to find a way to go after the Democrats and Kamala Harris in particular. And he needed to get the news back on him. And so he did his typical, whether it's birtherism or attacking somebody, he did that yesterday. And so there was nothing new. In fact, Kailey, I kept thinking, I think the Democrats should adopt a new slogan, which is, it's not 2016 anymore. This is old. We need something new from him, and they're not getting it. So that was my take on it.
Rick, I mentioned what Donald Trump posted on Truth Social after he made the remarks at the NABJ. Crazy Kamala saying she's Indian, not black. This is a big deal, stone cold phony. Is this the path to losing the election?
Look, I know there are a lot of Republicans. John Thune mentioned this. These are inappropriate comments, and we ought to be talking about the issues that Republicans have an advantage on, the economy, the border, and why he would go on a show like that, which would be seen by a lot of black voters and be disparaging of someone's, ethnic background, regardless of how you call it, is phenomenal to me. And of course, he uses the same trope that, well, I barely know her, except that he wrote a campaign contribution to her when she was a Democrat as a black candidate. And so I think he knows a lot more than he leads on. And so, I think the Republican Party would rather him be talking about the issues of the day that advantage the campaign than going down this sort of rabbit hole on, frankly, kind of reverse woke cultural battles that, nobody thinks is actually as relevant today as it was maybe back in 2016.
Reverse woke. That's a good one. That's a new one. Even Senator Tommy Tuberville didn't want anything to do with this. The coach from Alabama, quote, "I ain't getting involved in that. Let him talk about what he wants to talk about," unquote. That's where we are in American politics today, Kailey. But I will point everyone back to the remarkable news that we started this hour with, and that is the release of 4 Americans as part of a huge prisoner swap with Russia. That also happened today.
Yeah, and as the president said, good news, and especially good news for the families that were with him at the White House. So a remarkable day in Washington. We're glad to spend some of it, as always, with our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Thank you both so much, and we'll have more ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, "Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where today we have been talking a lot about some pretty momentous news. A prisoner exchange with Russia involving dozens of individuals, including 4 Americans who had been detained, who are now on their way home. That includes journalists also Kumasheva, Evan Gershkovich, and of course, former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan. We're just hearing now from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who is speaking to reporters. He says that Evan and Paul are expected back on American soil tonight. He says that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will greet them as after they were released in this swap. But also some interesting news from Jake Sullivan when it pertains to the other thing we're watching, which is escalating tensions in the Middle East. Jake Sullivan says that President Biden will be speaking with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu later today.
Once again, Joe Biden finding himself in a position to call for calm and a proportionate response. In this case, coming from Iran. Kailey, the IDF, we're told, is bracing for revenge right now, gaming out options on what might come back to Israel from Iran following the strike that killed the political leader of Hamas in Tehran itself. They have vowed revenge. It's not a question of whether this will happen, but to what extent it will happen. And we want to talk to Kailey Grieco about this among some of the other geopolitical stories that we're following. F-16s have just started arriving in Ukraine, for instance. Kailey, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program, and it's great to have you back. Kailey, you talked to us back in April about the risk of a wider regional conflict when Israel was bracing at that point for retaliation, once again, from Iran. Will the U.S. and Israel be able to diffuse it like they did back in April?
Well, thank you for having me. Certainly deja vu all over again. We're rolling the dice again. I think there are a couple of things. This is similar in some ways to what happened in April, that we're bracing for another attack, likely an attack directly on Israel. But there are some really important differences that make me more concerned about being able to manage it. One is that from Iran's perspective, this is a massive deterrence failure. They had hoped when they launched the April attack in response to when Israel conducted strikes against an embassy compound, killing some Iranian senior commanders. They had hoped that massive 300 drones and missile barrage would act as a deterrent, preventing Israel from doing something else, particularly something against Iran directly, and that hasn't worked. So they're going to feel a need to do something more escalatory to send that signal, that message to deter Iran moving forward. And of course, that makes this very dangerous. And then we add to it the humiliation piece for Iran, that this happened right in Tehran, in the senior government. They're celebrating an inauguration, and that's a dangerous combination.
Well, so Kailey, if we are comparing this moment to what we saw back in April, there was also a narrative after that failed attack that Iran sent, those drones and missiles pretty much all intercepted by Israel, the U.S., and other allies, that it showed a failure on the part of Iran. What else does Iran potentially have to throw at Israel here? Have we seen the full extent of their capability?
Yeah, so I would say two things. I think we should be cautious about what happened in April, because as someone who studies air power really closely, that looked a lot like what I would call operational theater. If they were serious about penetrating Israeli airspace, air defenses, you do not send your slowest drones first, alerting us that we have a 4-hour, 6-hour, notification that there's an attack starting, right? They would have started with ballistic missiles. They did quite the opposite, starting with the slowest thing. And so I think they were actually intending to a large degree for these things to be intercepted, sort of a display of force. I don't know if we're going to see that this time. This might be, a much more serious, sophisticated attack that's harder to defend against. And then I think we add to that, which is, as you're saying, which is there's other options here. This was calibrated last time. They did not involve proxy actors, whether that's in Lebanon or Syria or Yemen. So that's another option as well. It could be a more sophisticated attack. It could be a larger coordinated attack with proxies in the region.
Will we see the U.S. and allies providing the same defense role that we saw last time, actually knocking missiles out of the air on behalf of Israel?
Yeah, so yesterday Secretary Austin was asked about it, and he said that we would again stand by Israel and defend it. It sounds like the United States is prepared to do that again. I do think there are real questions, though, about whether we'll see the same kind of coordination we saw last time with Saudi Arabia and Jordan in particular, that allowed us to intercept things in their airspace. They've all sent out statements condemning Israel's actions. I think this makes it harder for them to repeat that from last time. And the other thing I just add is this is very expensive for us, the United States, when we're using these kinds of interceptor missiles that we really need in other theaters, whether it's Ukraine or it's the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's a question too, just about how many more times are we going to actually be able to do this in support of Israel?
Well, which gets us back to our own defense industrial base, which was so much the question in the debate over aid for Ukraine. And certainly we've even heard the likes of vice presidential nominee on the Republican side, J.D. Vance, talking about how the U.S. should be reserving more of its ammunitions and power for other areas in need other than Ukraine. On that subject, though, Kelly, of course, in addition to the theater we're talking about in the Middle East, there is still the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. And we got the news yesterday that the first round of F-16 deliveries has made it to Ukraine from NATO allies. How quickly will those jets make a difference?
I don't think they're going to make much of a difference. And that's, we know that there are probably about 6 or so pilots that are graduating this summer. By the end of the year, it'll be about 20. And usually it's 2 pilots per aircraft is sort of the rule of thumb. So maybe about 10 aircraft at most will be operating by the end of the year. It's a fairly small number. But I also just think that the F-16 capabilities, you see the Ukrainians kind of walking back some of their earlier statements about how impactful these would be, that they're not going to be able to use these to sort of gain air superiority and be able to, support ground troops on the ground close to the front lines because of Russian air defenses. So it's going to be really limited to more of an air defense role, perhaps, intercepting some cruise missiles and drones if they're able to successfully do that. It's expensive, these F-16s, but the actual impact on the battlefield, I fear, will be quite limited.
I don't know if my eyes are right, Kelly, but for our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, that appears to be a picture of a Spitfire you have framed behind you there in your office. And of course, the legendary aircraft that helped to win the Battle of Britain. What then is Ukraine's Spitfire, if not these?
You have a very good eye, first of all, because you are correct. It's a Spitfire. I would say it's mobile ground-based air defenses. Things like the Patriot, the NASAMS that we've sent. Those have been the critical for them in keeping back most of Russia's air force at bay, because they can move them and they can shoot and they can scoop. Of course, the challenge is we only have so many interceptor missiles. We were just talking about this in reference to Israel. So there is some idea that perhaps the F-16s can help to take a little bit of that, doing it in an air-to-air role. It's a very expensive way to do that. But it's really been these mobile ground-based air defenses. And I would just say, looking at how important they have been, and they've been a challenge for the United States to find these kinds of things in other war zones and locate them and destroy them. We should be thinking about this. We don't have enough, clearly, on the United States side, getting back to the defense industrial base. And we really need to start making smart investments, prioritizing air and missile defense.
How long does it take for those investments to actually come to fruition, though, Kelly? What kind of timeline realistically are we considering here, and what kind of resources?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real concern, right? We're talking multi-years. The number of, they're trying right now for the Patriot, for example, to increase the number of interceptors at around 500, maybe to get to 750. But already they're starting to find, even with that goal, things that they're not supply shortages, like very particular parts, there are shortages. And, Japan was trying to ramp up some of the missile production, and the same thing, like they can't do it because of a certain part having a shortage. And so there are all these bottlenecks in the defense industrial base, all the components, and not just the assembling of the part itself. And so this is really a multi-year effort to figure out how to resolve this and where to prioritize those efforts as well. Like, where are the central areas that we should really be trying to ramp up the defense industrial base? And I would just argue that air and missile defense is certainly one of those top priority areas.
Kelly, I just want to get back to where we started here before we let you go, and that's, of course, the situation in Israel. What's the critical window here? Do you give this the weekend to resolve? When will we see something?
Yeah, so I think there's a likelihood we could see it this weekend. I think the longer this gets delayed, the better. The one concern that I have is I feel like the Biden administration's response has been a bit sluggish. to these events. And I don't know if it's because of the swap of prisoners with Russia that a lot of the team was focused on that. But, we haven't seen, as far as I know, no one's been sent to the region to try to, do shuttle diplomacy like last time. And so I'm hoping, very quickly we're going to see some of that might even buy us some time before Iran responds. But it could be as soon as this weekend.
Well, we do know, as I mentioned at the top of this segment, Jake Sullivan says President Biden will be speaking with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Is that likely to be an advice call, Kelly, or is that a reassurance call that the U.S. will be there for Israel, whatever comes its way?
Yeah. I feel like it should probably be a grievance call first. Perspective. I mean, he's been working and his team has been working to try to get a ceasefire to release hostages. And it seems to have been very, very close. And in fact, Israel seems to be the party that pulled back away from it. And of course, Israel has now effectively killed one of the people that was involved in the negotiations. And so I think it's going to be really hard to get a ceasefire deal. And I think that's something the administration really wanted. And now not only is there not a ceasefire probably, but we're back at the real danger of a regional war. And I can't imagine the Biden administration is particularly happy, but they've also tied themselves so closely to Netanyahu that they don't really have as much of a choice, but in some ways to support him. And it seems like that is something Biden administration is prepared to do, including defending with U.S. military power.
All right, Kelly Grieco, sobering conversation, but thank you so much, as always, for joining us.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.